Officer Blake's laughter died in his throat as the little girl's chin lifted higher, her voice cutting through the crowd with quiet steel. "My daddy's coming, and when he gets here, you'll see." She didn't know that across the parking lot, Sergeant First Class Jonathan Rivers was already walking toward them, his Ranger tab catching the afternoon sun. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're ready to witness how one little girl's faith in her Ranger father changed everything, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I'll be sharing another powerful story of love and redemption you won't want to miss. Now let us begin. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but Officer Blake Martinez still gripped the paper cup like it might anchor him to something solid. His patrol car idled outside the community center, engine humming a rhythm that matched the dull ache behind his temples. 23 years on the force, and lately every call felt like pushing through quicksand. The divorce papers sat folded in his glove compartment, signed, but not yet filed. Maybe tomorrow, he told himself for the 15th time this month. Blake's radio crackled. Unit 47. "We've got reports of kids skateboarding in the Riverside Mall parking lot. Managers requesting removal." "Copy that," Blake muttered, crushing the empty cup. Kids. Always kids these days, thinking rules didn't apply to them. His own teenage son hadn't returned his calls in 3 weeks, not since the custody hearing. The irony wasn't lost on him, spending his days dealing with other people's children while his own slipped further away. He pulled into the mall parking lot, scanning for the usual suspects. A group of teenagers clustered around the loading dock, boards clattering against concrete. But what caught his attention was the small figure sitting alone on a bench near the entrance. A girl, maybe 8 or 9, dark skin gleaming in the afternoon sun, carefully organizing what looked like school supplies in a pink backpack. Where are this kid's parents? Blake thought, the familiar weight of suspicion settling into his chest. 15 miles across town, Sergeant First Class Jonathan Rivers knelt in front of his daughter Zuri, adjusting the straps of her backpack with the same precision he'd once used to check his squad's gear before a mission. The afternoon light streaming through their apartment window caught the subtle tremor in his hands, not from nerves, but from the phantom pain that still visited his left shoulder on humid days like this. "Daddy, tell me again about the time you carried Corporal Williams 12 miles, Zuri said, her eyes bright with the kind of hero worship that both humbled and terrified him. Jonathan's jaw tightened slightly. "Baby girl, that's not a story for... Please." She reached up and traced the small scar along his jawline, a gesture so tender it nearly undid him. "I like the brave stories." He caught her small hand in his larger one, feeling the calluses on his palm from years of rappelling ropes and rifle grips. "The brave thing wasn't carrying him, Zuzu. The brave thing was letting the team help me when my shoulder gave out on mile 10. Zuri frowned, processing this. "But you saved him." "We saved him. All of us." Jonathan stood, checking his watch. "Now your art supplies are all set for the community center program. Mrs. Chen will pick you up at 5, but I'll be there before then to check on your project." "The one about heroes?" Something shifted in Jonathan's chest, pride mixed with worry. His daughter's school assignment was to create a poster about someone she admired, and she'd chosen him. He'd spent 3 sleepless nights wondering if he deserved that kind of faith. The nightmares still came sometimes. Fragments of missions where not everyone made it home. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that heroes are just people who keep moving forward despite being scared? "Remember what we talked about," he said, shouldering his own gear bag. "If anyone gives you trouble, stand tall, speak clear, and know that you love me." Zuri recited the words like a pledge, and Jonathan felt his throat tighten. "That's my girl." Blake parked his cruiser and approached the bench where the girl sat. She looked up as his shadow fell across her backpack, and he was struck by the directness of her gaze. Most kids avoided eye contact with cops, either from guilt or learned wariness. "Hey there," Blake said, his voice softer than he'd intended. "You waiting for someone?" "Yes, sir. My daddy's coming to check on my art project." She gestured toward the community center. "I'm making a poster about heroes." Blake glanced around the parking lot. No adults in sight except the teenagers he was supposed to be dealing with. "How long you been waiting?" "Not long. Daddy's never late." The certainty in her voice was absolute, unshakable. Right, Blake thought. Another absent father, another kid making excuses. He'd seen it 1,000 times. Children abandoned in public spaces, spinning elaborate stories to explain why no one was coming for them. What do you think shapes our first impressions of people we've never met? Share your thoughts below about how we can see past our assumptions. What's your name, sweetheart? Zuri Rivers. My daddy's in the army. He's a ranger. She said it with the kind of pride that made Blake's chest ache, not because he believed her, but because he remembered feeling that way about his own father once, before he learned that heroes were just stories we told ourselves. Blake's radio crackled again, but he ignored it. This kid needed someone to stay with her until a social worker could be called. He'd seen too many children left alone, too many elaborate fantasies created to cope with abandonment. "That's quite a story, Zuri," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "Tell me more about this ranger father of yours." In the distance, a black pickup truck turned into the parking lot, but Blake didn't notice. He was too busy wondering how long it would take for this little girl's story to crumble and whether he had enough left in him to catch her when it did. Zuri's small hands smoothed over her poster board, revealing a carefully drawn figure in military fatigues. The colored pencils had been applied with the meticulous precision of a child who understood that some things were too important to rush. "He's been deployed 3 times, she continued, her finger tracing the ranger tab she'd colored in bright yellow. "Once to Afghanistan, once to Iraq, and once to a place he can't tell me about because it's classified." Blake felt something twist in his stomach, not sympathy, but irritation. The details were too polished, too rehearsed. He'd heard variations of this story from countless kids whose fathers had walked out, whose mothers had fed them elaborate lies to ease the sting of abandonment. The specificity only made it worse somehow, as if someone had coached her on what would sound believable. "Classified, huh?" Blake's voice carried an edge he hadn't intended. "That's convenient." Zuri's head snapped up, confusion flickering across her features. "Nothing, sweetheart. Keep telling me about this, Ranger father." The word came out slightly mocking, and Blake immediately regretted it. But something about the girl's absolute certainty grated against every disappointment he'd accumulated over 2 decades of police work. Kids lied. Parents lied. Everyone built castles in the air when reality got too heavy to bear. "He taught me how to tie a bowline knot," Zuri said, reaching into her backpack and pulling out a length of paracord. Her small fingers moved with surprising dexterity, creating the loop Blake recognized from his own brief stint in the military before a knee injury and poor choices had redirected his life toward law enforcement. "And he says the most important thing a soldier learns isn't how to fight, but how to come home." The knot was perfect, too perfect for an 8-year-old to tie without serious instruction. Blake stared at it, feeling something cold settle in his chest. Either this kid had been coached extensively, or, no, he'd been down this road before. Hope was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when it came to protecting children from their own fantasies. "That's a neat trick," Blake said, his voice flat. "Bet you saw that on YouTube." Zuri's face crumpled slightly, but she recovered quickly, chin lifting in a gesture that reminded Blake uncomfortably of his own son during their last argument. "My daddy taught me. He teaches me lots of things, like how to read a compass, and why rangers always finish their missions, and why." Okay. Blake held up a hand, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. "Look, Zuri. I'm sure whoever's supposed to pick you up will be here soon, but maybe we should call—" "He's not whoever." The sharpness in her voice stopped him cold. "He's my daddy, and he's coming, and he really is a ranger, and I don't know why you don't believe me." Blake's radio squawked, "Unit 47, status on the skateboard situation?" He grabbed the radio with more force than necessary. "Still in progress." The teenagers had long since scattered, but he couldn't leave this kid alone, and he couldn't shake the growing certainty that no one was coming for her. "Listen, sweetie," Blake said, crouching down to Zuri's eye level. "Sometimes grown-ups tell stories to make us feel better about things that are hard to understand. It doesn't mean they don't love us, it just means, my daddy doesn't lie to me." Zuri's voice was steel wrapped in silk, and he really is a ranger. He has medals and everything. He got hurt saving his friend, and sometimes his shoulder still hurts when it rains. And he has nightmares sometimes. But he says that's just his brain's way of making sure he remembers to be grateful for being home. The specificity hit Blake like a physical blow. These weren't the polished details of a rehearsed story, they were the raw, complicated truths of real life. The kind of details a child would only know if she'd lived with them, comforted someone through them, absorbed them into her understanding of what love looked like. But 23 years of disappointment had built thick walls around Blake's capacity for belief. He laughed. It started as a bitter chuckle, the sound escaping before he could stop it. Then it grew, fed by exhaustion and cynicism, and the crushing weight of too many broken promises. The sound echoed off the concrete, harsh and ugly in the afternoon air. "A ranger," Blake said, shaking his head. "Right, and I suppose he's going to come riding up in a Humvee any minute now." Zuri went very still. The color drained from her face, but her eyes caught fire. "You don't believe me." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation that cut straight through Blake's chest. "Sweetheart, I've been doing this job for a long time, and—" "You think I'm lying?" Each word was carefully enunciated, as if she were testing their weight. "You think my daddy isn't real?" Blake felt the moment tilting away from him, spiraling toward something he couldn't control. "I think you're a little girl who's been waiting a long time for someone who isn't coming, and sometimes our imagination—" "My daddy is coming." Zuri stood up, her small frame vibrating with fury and hurt. "And when he gets here, you'll see. You'll see, and then you'll be sorry you laughed at me." The certainty in her voice should have been heartbreaking. Instead, it just made Blake laugh harder. Have you ever had someone dismiss something important to you? Tell us in the comments how it felt and what you wish they had done differently. Across the parking lot, Jonathan Rivers stepped out of his black pickup truck, his trained eyes immediately scanning the scene, his daughter standing rigid with anger, a police officer laughing, and something in the air that made every instinct he'd honed over years of combat suddenly snap to attention. Blake's laughter died abruptly as he noticed the small crowd beginning to gather. A few teenagers with skateboards had drifted closer, phones already out, recording. An elderly woman pushing a shopping cart had stopped to stare. A couple heading into the community center paused mid-conversation, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern. Shit. The last thing he needed was another viral video of a cop having a moment with a child. Blake's jaw clenched as he straightened up, his training kicking in. Control the situation. Manage the optics. Protect the department's reputation. "All right. Everyone keep moving," Blake called out, his voice carrying the authority that had served him for over 2 decades. "Nothing to see here, just checking on a lost child." "I'm not lost." Zuri's voice cracked like a whip across the parking lot. "And I'm not lying." Blake felt heat creep up his neck. The kid was making this worse, drawing more attention with every outburst. He crouched down again, lowering his voice to what he hoped was a calming tone. "Zuri, I understand you're upset, but you need to calm down. We're going to figure this out, okay? We'll call someone from social services and—" "No!" The word exploded from Zuri with such force that several onlookers stepped closer. "You don't get to call anyone. My daddy is coming. He's probably here already." She spun around, scanning the parking lot with desperate eyes. Blake followed her gaze and spotted a black pickup truck, but the figure walking toward them was still too far away to make out clearly. Just another parent, probably, wondering what the commotion was about. He'd dealt with this scenario countless times, concerned citizens who thought they could insert themselves into police business. "Look, sweetheart," Blake said, his patience fraying at the edges. "I don't want to believe," Zuri interrupted, her small hands balled into fists. "I do believe, because it's true, because my daddy doesn't lie to me, and because," she took a shaky breath, "because he promised he'd always come when I needed him." The raw vulnerability in her voice made something twist uncomfortably in Blake's chest. He thought of his own son, of promises broken and trust eroded. The familiar weight of his own failures pressed down on him, and he found himself pushing back against it the only way he knew how, with skepticism and detachment. "Promises are easy to make, kid," Blake muttered, more to himself than to her. But Zuri heard him. Her eyes widened, then narrowed into slits of pure fury. "You're mean," she said, her voice trembling. "You're mean, and you don't know anything about my daddy or me or what promises mean in our family." Blake felt the situation slipping further from his control. More people were stopping now, drawn by the raised voices and obvious tension. Someone had definitely started recording. His radio crackled with dispatch checking on his status, but he couldn't respond without looking incompetent. "This is exactly why I should have called social services immediately," Blake thought. Let them deal with delusional kids and absent parents. But even as he thought it, something about Zuri's unwavering certainty needled at him. Most abandoned children eventually cracked under pressure, admitted the truth, started crying for their mothers. This kid just kept digging in deeper, as if her faith in this mythical ranger father was carved from stone. "Ma'am, is everything all right here?" The voice came from behind Blake, and he turned to see the elderly woman with the shopping cart had approached. Her eyes were sharp, concerned, and clearly disapproving of whatever she thought she was witnessing. "Everything's fine," Blake said automatically. "Police business." "Doesn't look fine to me," the woman said, her gaze shifting to Zuri. "Honey, are you okay?" "Yes, ma'am," Zuri said, her voice steadying slightly at the woman's kindness. "I'm waiting for my daddy. He's in the army. He's a ranger." The woman's eyebrows rose. "Well, that's wonderful, dear. What's his name?" "Sergeant First Class Jonathan Rivers," Zuri said with perfect pronunciation, standing straighter as she spoke the rank and name. Blake felt another spike of irritation. The kid had every detail memorized, probably coached by whoever had filled her head with these fantasies. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this is a police matter. The child appears to have been abandoned, and we're following proper protocol." "Abandoned?" The elderly woman's voice rose an octave. "Did she tell you she was abandoned?" "She's been sitting here alone for over an hour, spinning stories about a father who obviously isn't coming." Blake snapped, his professional composure cracking. It's textbook abandonment behavior. When has someone's disbelief made you doubt something you knew was true? Share your experience in the comments below. Zuri's face went pale, but her chin lifted even higher. "He is coming. And when he gets here, you're going to feel really bad about being so mean to me." Blake laughed again, shorter and sharper this time. "Right. Well, when this ranger father of yours shows up, I'll be sure to—" "Excuse me, officer?" The voice cut through Blake's sarcasm like a blade through silk, deep, controlled, carrying an unmistakable note of authority that made Blake's spine straighten automatically. He turned to see a man in jeans and a plain black t-shirt approaching them, but there was something in his bearing, the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, the alertness in his eyes, that screamed military training. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his gaze shifting between Blake and Zuri. "Daddy!" Zuri's voice exploded with relief and vindication. She started toward him, but Blake instinctively stepped between them. "Sir, I need you to stay back while I determine—" "That's my daughter," Jonathan Rivers said quietly, and suddenly the air in the parking lot felt charged with electricity. Jonathan Rivers took in the scene with the systematic precision of a man trained to assess threats quickly. His daughter upset but unharmed, standing with the rigid posture she adopted when trying not to cry. The police officer defensive stance, hand unconsciously resting near his radio, sweat beading despite the mild weather. The crowd, phones out, recording, creating the kind of volatile situation that could explode in any direction. "Daddy, he doesn't believe you're real," Zuri said, her voice small but fierce. "He laughed at me when I told him about you." Jonathan's eyes never left Blake's face, but something shifted in his expression, a tightening around the edges that made Blake's training alarms start screaming. This wasn't some deadbeat dad showing up with excuses. This was someone who knew exactly how dangerous situations could become and was calculating his next move accordingly. "Is that right?" Jonathan's voice remained level, conversational even. But Blake caught the steel underneath, recognized the tone from his own brief military service. It was the voice commanders used right before someone's world got rearranged. "Sir, I was responding to reports of unattended minors," Blake said, falling back on protocol. "I found your daughter alone, and when I asked about her guardian, she provided information that seemed unlikely." "Unlikely?" Jonathan repeated the word like he was tasting something bitter. "What exactly seemed unlikely, officer?" "Martinez. And with all due respect, sir, children often create elaborate fantasies when they're dealing with abandonment issues. Your daughter claimed her father was an Army Ranger, which is exactly what I am." Jonathan's interruption was quiet but absolute. "Sergeant First Class Jonathan Rivers, 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. Would you like to see my ID?" Blake felt the ground shifting beneath him, but 23 years of police work had taught him never to back down publicly. Not in front of a crowd, not with phones recording. "Anyone can claim to be military, sir. I'll need to verify." "Of course you will." Jonathan reached slowly into his back pocket, his movements deliberate and visible, the way someone moved when they understood how quickly situations could escalate. He produced a wallet and extracted his military ID card. "Zuri, come here, baby girl." Zuri immediately moved to her father's side, and Blake watched her transformation with growing unease. The uncertain child who'd been defending her absent father was gone, replaced by a kid who clearly felt safe, protected, completely confident in her place in the world. Blake took the ID card, noting how Jonathan's fingers didn't quite straighten completely, old injury, probably the shoulder Zuri had mentioned. The card was legitimate, current, and the photo matched the man standing before him. Sergeant First Class Jonathan Rivers, just like his daughter had said. "This could be fake," Blake said, but the words felt hollow even to him. "It could be," Jonathan agreed calmly. "Would you like to call Fort Benning and verify? I can give you my commanding officer's direct number, or we could contact the community center director. I'm registered as Zuri's emergency contact for the after-school program." Blake's radio crackled. "Unit 47. We've got a disturbance reported at your location. Do you need backup?" The crowd had grown larger, phones still recording, and Blake could see the situation spiraling out of control. Someone had called in a disturbance, which meant supervisors would be asking questions. A simple welfare check was becoming a public relations nightmare. Negative, dispatch. Situation under control, Blake responded, though nothing felt under control. Officer Martinez, Jonathan said, his voice taking on a different quality, not threatening, but carrying the kind of authority that came from years of leading men in life-or-death situations. I appreciate you checking on my daughter's welfare. That's your job, and I respect that. But I need you to understand something. Zuri has never lied to you. Not once. Everything she told you was true. Blake stared at the ID card in his hands, feeling something cold and ugly spreading through his chest. Every detail Zuri had mentioned, the deployments, the shoulder injury, the classified mission, even the philosophy about coming home, all of it was probably true, which meant, "I was doing my job," Blake said weakly. "Were you?" Jonathan asked. And the question hung in the air like a challenge. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you decided my daughter was lying before you had any evidence to support that conclusion." The elderly woman who'd approached earlier stepped closer. "Officer, this man has shown you his identification. Surely that resolves the matter." Blake felt trapped. Protocol demanded he verify the ID, but doing so now would look like he was desperately trying to save face. Not doing so would mean admitting he'd been wrong from the beginning. Either choice felt like defeat. "Standard procedure requires verification of military credentials," Blake said, reaching for his radio. "I'll need to confirm this information with Base Command," Jonathan finished. "I understand. Zuri, why don't you go finish your poster while Officer Martinez and I sort this out? I'll be right here." "Daddy, I don't want to leave you," Zuri said, her small hand gripping Jonathan's larger one. "I'm not going anywhere, baby girl, but we need to let Officer Martinez do his job properly this time." The subtle emphasis on this time hit Blake like a slap. Jonathan was giving him an opportunity to save face, to handle the situation professionally instead of defensively. It was an act of grace that Blake wasn't sure he deserved. How do we rebuild trust after making assumptions about someone? What's the first step toward making things right? Share your thoughts below. "The community center has Wi-Fi," Jonathan continued. "I can give you my CO's email address, unit contact information, whatever you need to verify. But we're going to do this properly, with my daughter present so she can see how adults handle misunderstandings when they're committed to getting to the truth." Blake looked at Zuri, who was watching him with an expression that seemed far too wise for her 8 years. She wasn't gloating or demanding an apology. She was just waiting to see what kind of man he would choose to be. The community center's lobby felt smaller with both men in it. Jonathan sat in one of the plastic chairs, Zuri working quietly on her poster at the table beside him, while Blake hunched over his laptop attempting to verify credentials that he already knew were legitimate. The Wi-Fi was painfully slow, giving all three of them too much time to think. Blake's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he stared at the screen displaying Jonathan's service record. 3 deployments. Multiple commendations. A Purple Heart. The shoulder injury Zuri had mentioned was right there in the medical notes. Shrapnel damage sustained while evacuating wounded personnel under fire. Everything she said was true. The weight of that realization sat heavy in Blake's chest. He glanced over at Zuri, who was carefully coloring in what looked like a flag on her poster, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. She looked so young, so trusting, so certain that the world would eventually make sense if you just waited long enough for truth to surface. "When was the last time I had that kind of faith in anything?" "Officer Martinez?" Jonathan's voice was quiet, careful not to disturb Zuri's concentration. "Can I ask you something?" Blake looked up from the laptop. "Sure. Do you have kids?" The question hit like a physical blow. Blake's hand automatically moved toward his left ring finger, where his wedding band had lived for 15 years before the divorce papers made it irrelevant. A son, 16. Clothes? Blake's throat constricted. The last time he'd seen Danny, the kid had looked right through him like he was a stranger. The last text message had been 3 weeks ago. Can't make it this weekend. Have plans, no explanation, no rescheduling, just another door slamming shut. Not lately, Blake admitted. Jonathan nodded, understanding flickering in his expression. It's hard, isn't it? Being the kind of father you want to be when the job demands so much. The job. Blake started, then stopped. It wasn't the job that had driven his family away, it was the cynicism, the way he'd started seeing everyone as a potential threat or problem to be managed. It was coming home every night with the weight of other people's broken promises and lost children and having nothing left to give his own family. I used to think the hardest thing about deployment was being shot at, Jonathan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Turns out the hardest thing is coming home and trying to remember how to be the person your child believes you are. Blake's fingers went still on the keyboard. What do you mean? Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, watching Zuri color. Second deployment, I was leading a night raid when everything went sideways. Lost 2 good men because I made a call that seemed right at the time, but turned out to be wrong. Took shrapnel trying to get them out, but we were too late. Blake found himself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite himself. When I came home, Zuri would ask me to tell her about being brave, about saving people, and all I could think about was Marcus Williams bleeding out in my arms, asking me to tell his daughter he loved her. Jonathan's voice caught slightly. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that her hero has blood on his hands? You don't, Blake said automatically. You protect her from that. Do you? Jonathan turned to look at Blake directly. Or do you let the weight of it change how you see everything else? Do you start assuming the worst about people because you've seen too much of what we're capable of? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Blake thought about the divorce papers in his glove compartment, about his son's unanswered calls, about the way he'd looked at Zuri and immediately assumed she was lying because that was easier than believing in something good. Your son, Jonathan said carefully. What happened there? Blake's hands clenched involuntarily. I got too good at my job. Too good at seeing through people's stories, questioning their motives, assuming they were lying until proven otherwise. After a while, that's how I looked at everyone, including my family. Even your son. Especially my son. The admission came out rough, like gravel. When he started getting into trouble at school, staying out past curfew, hanging around kids I didn't approve of, I handled it like a cop instead of a father. Interrogated him instead of listening. Assumed he was lying about everything because lying was what people did in my experience. Blake stared at his hands, remembering the last real conversation he'd had with Danny. The kid had been trying to explain why he'd been suspended from school, something about defending a friend who was being bullied. But all Blake had heard were the inconsistencies in the story, the defensive tone, the familiar pattern of a teenager trying to avoid consequences. I didn't believe him, Blake said quietly. Called him a liar to his face. Found out later from his mother that every word was true. The kid had gotten suspended for standing up to 3 older students who were picking on a freshman with autism. But by then, it was too late. He was done trying to prove himself to me. Have you ever regretted not believing someone who was telling you the truth? How did you handle making it right? Share your story below. Zuri looked up from her poster, having caught some undercurrent in the adult conversation. Daddy, is Officer Martinez sad? Jonathan and Blake both turned to look at her, this small person who seemed to have an uncanny ability to see straight through to the heart of things. I think he might be, baby girl, Jonathan said gently. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt people they love, and that makes them very sad. Can they fix it? Zuri asked, her crayon suspended over her poster. Sometimes, Jonathan said, his eyes meeting Blake's across the small space. If they're brave enough to try. Blake stared at this man who had every right to be angry with him, who instead was showing him a kind of grace Blake wasn't sure he'd ever extended to anyone else. And he thought about his son, about phone calls not returned, and weekends that never happened, about all the ways fear had masqueraded as protection until there was nothing left to protect. The verification came through, Blake said, though he hadn't actually checked the screen in several minutes. Everything checks out. You're exactly who your daughter said you were. And you're exactly the kind of officer I'd want checking on her welfare, Jonathan replied. Someone who cares enough to make sure she's safe even if the execution was a little rough around the edges. The forgiveness in those words nearly undid Blake completely. "Can I see your posters, Zuri?" Blake asked, surprising himself with the gentleness in his own voice. Zuri looked to her father, who nodded encouragingly. She carefully turned the poster board around, revealing a detailed drawing of a soldier in combat fatigues standing next to a much smaller figure in civilian clothes. Above them, in carefully printed letters, were the words, "My hero, Daddy." But it was the details that caught Blake's attention. The soldier's left shoulder was positioned slightly lower than the right, a subtle indication of injury that most kids wouldn't think to include. The smaller figure was holding what looked like a piece of paracord tied in a perfect bowline knot, and in the corner, barely visible, was a tiny flag with a yellow tab drawn on top. "That's your Ranger tab," Blake said, pointing to the detail. "Zuri's got a good eye," Jonathan said, pride evident in his voice. "Better than most adults when it comes to observing details." "I drew you smaller than you really are," Zuri said to her father, frowning slightly at her work, "but I couldn't fit you real size on the paper." Blake found himself smiling, actually smiling, for the first time in weeks. "He's pretty tall, isn't he?" 6'2", Zuri said, matter-of-factly. "But Daddy says being a hero isn't about how big you are on the outside, it's about how big your heart is on the inside." Jonathan's cheeks reddened slightly. "Zuri, Officer Martinez probably doesn't need to hear all my—" "No, it's okay," Blake interrupted. "She's right, that's actually really wise." An uncomfortable silence settled over them, broken only by the sound of Zuri's crayon moving across paper as she added final touches to her poster. Blake found himself studying Jonathan more carefully, not with the suspicious eye of a cop, but with genuine curiosity. The man carried himself with obvious military bearing, but there was something else there too, a gentleness in how he watched his daughter, a patience that Blake envied. "How do you do it?" Blake asked suddenly. "Do what?" "Be the father she thinks you are. After everything you've seen, everything that's happened, how do you not let it poison everything else?" Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "Honestly, some days I don't know if I do it right. Some days I wake up and the first thing I think about is Marcus Williams, or Corporal Johnson, or any of the other good men who didn't make it home, and I wonder if I deserve to be here when they're not." Blake nodded, understanding flooding through him. And then Zuri asks me to help her with her shoelaces, or tells me about something funny that happened at school, or," Jonathan gestured toward the poster, "or she draws a picture of me and calls me her hero, and I remember that maybe the point isn't whether I deserve it. Maybe the point is just trying to be worthy of the faith she has in me." "One day at a time," Blake murmured. "One day at a time," Jonathan agreed. Zuri looked up from her poster with the sudden intensity that children could shift into without warning. "Officer Martinez, do you have a picture of your son?" Blake's hand instinctively moved toward his wallet, then stopped. Yes, but we haven't talked in a while." "Can I see?" Blake hesitated, then pulled out his wallet and extracted a school photo from 2 years ago. Danny at 14, before the worst of their falling out, still young enough to smile genuinely for pictures. He handed it to Zuri, who studied it with the same careful attention she'd given her poster. "He looks nice," she said finally. "He has kind eyes like you do." "Like me?" Blake almost laughed. "Sweetheart, I don't think anyone's ever accused me of having kind eyes." "But you do," Zuri insisted, with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "They're sad, but they're kind. Daddy has sad eyes sometimes too, but they're still good eyes." Blake looked at Jonathan, who was watching this exchange with something that might have been understanding. "Kids see things we don't always see in ourselves," Jonathan said quietly. "Daddy says everyone's fighting a battle we don't know about," Zuri continued, still studying Danny's photo. "Maybe your son is fighting a battle too, and he needs his daddy to help him, but he doesn't know how to ask." The simplicity of it hit Blake like a physical blow. All his assumptions about Danny's rebellion, his withdrawal, his refusal to engage, what if it wasn't rejection? What if it was just a 16-year-old kid who didn't know how to bridge the gap his father had created? "When was the last time you tried to call him?" Jonathan asked gently. 3 weeks ago, he didn't answer. And before that? Blake had to think about it. Maybe a month before that? Jonathan nodded slowly. "After my first deployment, I came home and expected everything to be exactly the same. When it wasn't, when Zuri seemed different, more independent, I pulled back. Figured she didn't need me as much anymore. Took her mother sitting me down and explaining that children don't outgrow needing their fathers, they just need them differently." "What's the longest you've gone without reaching out to someone important to you? What stopped you from making that call or sending that text? Let us know in the comments." "What if he doesn't want to hear from me?" Blake asked, voicing the fear that had kept him paralyzed for months. "What if he does?" Zuri asked, looking up from the photo with those impossibly wise eyes. "What if he's been waiting for you to call, but he's too scared to call you first because he thinks you don't want to talk to him either?" Blake stared at this 8-year-old who seemed to understand human nature better than most adults he knew. "How did you get so smart?" "Daddy reads me lots of books," Zuri said proudly, "and he always tells me the truth, even when it's hard. He says the truth is like medicine. Sometimes it tastes bad, but it makes you feel better after." Jonathan caught Blake's eye and shrugged slightly, as if to say, "Kids, what can you do?" For the first time in months, Blake felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking, but expanding. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to be the father Danny needed him to be. "You know what?" Blake said, pulling out his phone. "I think I'm going to call my son." Zuri clapped her hands together, delighted. "Can we listen?" "Zuri," Jonathan chided gently. "No, it's okay," Blake said, surprised to find that he meant it. "If he answers, you can meet him. I think he'd like you both." Blake's finger hovered over Danny's contact information, his heart hammering against his ribs with an intensity that reminded him of his first traffic stop 23 years ago. Zuri had scooted closer, her eyes bright with anticipation, while Jonathan maintained a respectful distance but offered an encouraging nod. "Here goes nothing," Blake muttered, pressing the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Yeah?" Danny's voice came through the speaker, flat and guarded, carrying the particular brand of wariness teenagers reserved for unwanted interruptions. "Danny, it's Dad." A pause that stretched long enough for Blake to second-guess everything. In the background, he could hear music, voices, the sound of teenage life continuing without him. "What do you want?" The words hit Blake like a slap. "No hi, Dad. No how are you. just the blunt question of someone who'd learned not to expect good things from phone calls. I wanted to talk to you, see how you're doing." "I'm fine. Was there something specific? Or—" Blake felt his chest tightening, the familiar defensive walls starting to rebuild themselves. This was exactly what he'd expected, exactly why he'd stopped calling. The kid clearly didn't want anything to do with him. "I was hoping maybe we could get together this weekend. Maybe grab dinner." "Can't. I'm busy." "Busy with what?" The question came out sharper than Blake intended, carrying the edge of interrogation that had poisoned so many of their previous conversations. Another pause. When Danny spoke again, his voice had gone completely flat. "Does it matter? You'll just assume I'm lying anyway." The accusation hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Blake felt every old hurt, every failed conversation, every moment of mutual disappointment rushing back, and underneath it all, the terrible suspicion that maybe he'd been right all along. Maybe some relationships were just too broken to fix. "That's not fair," Blake said, aware that Zuri and Jonathan were listening to every word. "I'm trying here, Danny." "Are you?" "Because calling me once every 3 weeks and acting like everything's fine doesn't feel like trying. It feels like checking a box." The accuracy of the assessment was devastating. Blake felt heat rising in his cheeks, embarrassment and anger tangling together into something ugly and familiar. This was why he'd stopped trying. This was why hope was dangerous, because eventually reality came crashing back in. "Look, if you don't want to talk to me, just say so," Blake snapped. "I don't need the attitude." "There it is," Danny said, and Blake could hear the bitter satisfaction in his son's voice. "Took you all of 2 minutes to go back to being a cop instead of a dad." Blake's temper flared white-hot. "Don't you dare lecture me about being a father. I've been working my ass off to provide for you." "I never asked you to. I asked you to believe me when I told you the truth, and you couldn't even do that." The line went dead. Blake stared at his phone, his hand shaking slightly. The silence in the community center lobby felt suffocating. When he finally looked up, he saw Zuri watching him with wide, confused eyes, and Jonathan's expression had gone carefully neutral, the look of someone trying not to judge but unable to hide their disappointment. "Well," Blake said, forcing a harsh laugh, "that went about as well as expected." "Daddy?" Zuri whispered, tugging on Jonathan's sleeve. Why was his son so angry? Jonathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sometimes people hurt each other without meaning to, baby girl. And sometimes the hurt gets so big that it's hard to find a way past it." The gentle explanation, the patience in Jonathan's voice, the way he managed to answer his daughter's question without condemning Blake, it all made Blake feel exponentially worse. Here was a man who'd figured out how to be the father his child needed, while Blake couldn't even have a civil conversation with his own son. "Must be nice," Blake said, his voice carrying a bitter edge. "Having a kid who actually wants to talk to you." Jonathan's expression shifted, something cooling behind his eyes. "No, I get it. You've got it all figured out. Perfect father, perfect daughter, perfect little family unit." Blake was spiraling now, letting the familiar poison of his own self-loathing spill over onto everyone around him. "Some of us aren't cut out for the hero thing." "That's not what Isn't it?" Blake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You sit there with your medals and your wisdom and your 8-year-old who thinks you walk on water, judging me for not being able to fix what I broke." Zuri's eyes filled with tears. "I don't understand. Why are you being mean again?" The question stopped. Blake cold. He looked down at this little girl who'd shown him nothing but kindness, who'd tried to share her father with him, who'd believed that adults could figure out how to fix their mistakes. And he realized with horrible clarity that he was doing it again, lashing out at innocent people because he couldn't handle his own pain. But instead of apologizing, instead of stepping back from the edge, Blake doubled down. "You know what? Your dad's right to be proud of you. You're everything a parent could want in a kid. Not like mine. Not like the ungrateful, disrespectful." "Stop," Jonathan's voice cut through Blake's rant like a blade. "Don't you dare talk about your son that way. Not in front of my daughter. When we're hurting, we sometimes hurt others. Have you ever lashed out at someone who didn't deserve it? How did you make it right? Share your thoughts below." Blake felt something cold and final settle in his chest. The look in Jonathan's eyes, protective, disgusted, done with Blake's excuses, was the same look his ex-wife had given him the day she'd filed the divorce papers. The same look Danny had probably been giving him for months before he'd stopped trying altogether. "Right," Blake said, his voice hollow. "Perfect families don't need broken cops hanging around, dragging down the mood." He turned toward the door, leaving behind the warmth and possibility he'd glimpsed for exactly 47 minutes, walking back into the cold certainty that some people were just too damaged to deserve good things. Behind him, he heard Zuri crying softly, asking her father why Officer Martinez was so sad, why grown-ups hurt each other, why some people couldn't just say they were sorry. Blake kept walking. Blake sat in his patrol car for 20 minutes, staring at the community center through his windshield without really seeing it. The engine wasn't running. The radio was silent. The parking lot had mostly emptied, leaving him alone with the crushing weight of his own stupidity. His phone buzzed. Text message. "Unknown number. This is Jonathan Rivers. Zuri wanted me to send you this." Below the message was a photo, Zuri's poster, but now it had an addition, a second figure drawn in purple crayon standing next to the soldier and the little girl. The new figure wore what looked like a police uniform and had a sad face, but the little girl in the drawing was holding its hand. "She says everyone needs friends, even sad police officers." Blake stared at the image until his vision blurred. A 8-year-old had tried to fix his broken world with a purple crayon and the simple belief that loneliness could be cured by holding hands, and he'd repaid that kindness by having a meltdown and insulting her father. "What the hell is wrong with me?" His radio crackled to life. "Unit 47, you're needed for a domestic disturbance on 5th Street. Blake reached for the handset, then stopped. In 6 hours, his shift would be over. He'd go home to his empty apartment, eat something microwaved, and spend another evening channel surfing until exhaustion finally carried him into restless sleep. Tomorrow he'd wake up and do it all again, carrying his poison a little further into every interaction, building the walls a little higher. "Unit 47, please respond." Blake keyed the radio. "Unit 52 can handle it. I'm out of service." "Out of service? Blake, what's your status?" "Personal matter, Sergeant. I'll explain later." He turned off the radio before dispatch could respond. Blake's phone rang. The display showed his ex-wife's number. For a moment he considered ignoring it. Rebecca only called when there was a problem with Danny, and he wasn't sure he could handle another crisis today. But something about Zuri's drawing, about the way she'd added him to her family portrait despite everything, made him answer. "Rebecca." "Blake, I wasn't sure you'd pick up." Her voice carried the careful neutrality they'd developed since the divorce, polite but distant. "Danny called me. He said you two talked today." Blake's stomach dropped. "If you're calling to tell me I screwed up again..." "Actually, I'm calling to thank you." The words hit Blake like a physical blow. "What?" "He's been upset for weeks, Blake. Really upset. Not just the normal teenage stuff, but lost. He keeps asking me why you don't call anymore, why you gave up on him. I've been trying to convince him to reach out to you, but he's so scared of being rejected again." Blake felt like he was drowning. He said he was busy, he didn't want to talk. "Of course," he said that. You trained him to protect himself, Blake. When people expect the worst from you, you eventually stop giving them ammunition to use against you." The accuracy of that statement was devastating. Blake thought about his conversation with Danny, about how quickly he'd fallen back into old patterns, how readily he'd assumed his son's defensiveness was evidence of rejection rather than self-protection. "But Blake, he called me crying after you hung up. Not angry crying, hurt crying. The kind of crying that happens when someone you love disappoints you, not when someone you hate proves you right." Blake's hand tightened on the phone. "Rebecca, I don't understand. He still wants his father, Blake. He's just afraid you don't want him. And honestly, after watching you pull away from everyone who tries to get close to you, I can't blame him for being scared." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Blake thought about the last 2 years, the arguments, the missed weekends, the slow erosion of trust between him and the person who'd once looked at him like he hung the moon. "Is it too late?" Blake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, but I know that if you keep waiting for him to make the first move, it'll definitely be too late. He's 16, Blake. He doesn't have the emotional tools to fix what's broken between you two. That's the parent's job." After Rebecca hung up, Blake sat in the silence of his patrol car and thought about Jonathan Rivers, a man who'd come home from war carrying his own wounds, his own guilt, his own reasons to retreat from the world. But somehow Jonathan had chosen differently. He'd chosen to show up for his daughter even when it was hard, to be vulnerable even when it was scary, to keep faith in love even when experience suggested cynicism was safer. "One day at a time," Jonathan had said, "trying to be worthy of the faith she has in me." Blake looked at Zuri's drawing again. The purple figure holding hands with the family included, despite being sad, accepted, despite being flawed. A child's simple understanding that broken things could still be part of something beautiful. When was the last time you had to choose between pride and vulnerability? What helped you make that choice? Share your experience in the comments below. Blake's phone felt heavy in his hands as he scrolled to Danny's number. His finger hovered over the call button, terror and hope warring in his chest. What if his son didn't answer? What if he did answer, but the damage was already too deep to repair? What if Zuri's right? What if he's been waiting for you to call, but he's too scared to call you first? Blake pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, a familiar voice answered, tentative, hopeful despite itself. "Dad? Danny." Blake's voice cracked on his son's name. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, and I know I don't deserve it, but I'm wondering if maybe we could try again. Not as a cop and a suspect, but as a father and son who miss each other." The silence stretched so long that Blake wondered if the call had dropped. Then he heard it, a shaky breath, the sound of someone fighting back tears. "I'd like that, Dad. I'd really like that." Blake closed his eyes, feeling something inside his chest crack open and let in light for the first time in months. But first, he had 2 more people he needed to apologize to. Blake found them in the community center's main room, where Zuri was carefully packing her art supplies while Jonathan helped fold up tables. The poster lay flat on a nearby chair, the purple figure still holding hands with the family she'd drawn him into despite everything. "Excuse me," Blake said from the doorway, his voice softer than it had been all day. Jonathan looked up, his expression guarded but not hostile. Zuri turned around, and Blake was relieved to see that while her eyes were still slightly red from crying, they held more curiosity than fear. "I owe you both an apology," Blake continued, stepping into the room with the careful movements of someone approaching something precious that could easily be frightened away. "Actually, I owe you more than that, but an apology is where I need to start." Jonathan straightened, but didn't speak, waiting. Zuri looked between the two men with the intense focus she seemed to bring to everything important. "Zuri," Blake said, crouching down to her level, "I was wrong to get angry in front of you. I was wrong to say mean things about your dad, and I was wrong to let my own sadness make you cry. You didn't deserve any of that." Zuri studied his face with those impossibly wise eyes. "Are you still sad?" "Yes," Blake said honestly. "But I'm learning that being sad doesn't give me permission to hurt other people. Your daddy taught me that today." "He's good at teaching things," Zuri said, matter-of-factly. "He taught me that when you make a mistake, the brave thing is to say you're sorry and try to do better." Blake felt his throat tighten. "Your daddy is very smart, and you're very smart too. Are you going to try to do better?" The question was so direct, so completely without artifice, that Blake almost laughed, not the bitter laughter from earlier, but something warmer, something that acknowledged the beautiful simplicity of a child's worldview. "I'm going to try very hard," Blake said. "I just called my son, and we're going to have dinner this weekend. We're going to try to fix what's broken between us." Zuri's face lit up. "That's good. Did you tell him about me?" "Not yet, but I'd like to, if that's okay with you and your dad." Jonathan had been listening to this exchange with an expression Blake couldn't quite read. Now he spoke for the first time since Blake had returned. "What changed your mind?" Jonathan asked. "About calling Danny?" Blake stood up, facing the man who had every right to tell him to leave and never come back. "You did, both of you. Zuri, when you drew me into your family picture even after I was mean to you, that was the kind of grace I haven't shown my own son in 2 years. And Jonathan, watching you be the father she believes you are, even when it's hard, even when you're carrying your own pain, I realized I've been using my hurt as an excuse to stop trying." Blake pulled out his phone and showed them the text conversation with Rebecca. "My ex-wife told me something today. She said Danny's been crying because he thinks I don't want him anymore. All this time I thought he was rejecting me, but really he was just scared I was rejecting him." "Fear makes us do strange things," Jonathan said quietly. "Makes us push away the people we love most, because losing them slowly feels safer than risking having them torn away all at once. Is that what happened to you after your deployments?" Jonathan was quiet for a moment, his hand finding Zuri's shoulder in that automatic gesture Blake had noticed earlier. "For a while, I came home from my last deployment, convinced I didn't deserve the hero worship I saw in Zuri's eyes. Kept waiting for her to figure out I was just a broken soldier who couldn't save everyone. Took my therapist 6 months to help me understand that maybe the point wasn't being perfect. Maybe the point was just showing up, being present, loving her enough to keep trying even when I felt like a fraud." Blake nodded, understanding flooding through him. "And now, do you still feel like a fraud?" "Sometimes," Jonathan admitted. "But then Zuri asks me to help with her homework, or tells me about her day, or draws a picture of us together, and I remember that love isn't about being perfect, it's about being available." What does being available mean to you in your relationships? How do you show up for the people you love? Let us know in the comments below. Zuri had been following this conversation with the intense concentration she brought to everything, and now she looked up at Blake with sudden inspiration. "Officer Martinez, do you want to sign my poster? Are you sure? After everything that happened? Daddy says that forgiveness means giving people a chance to be better than their worst moment," Zuri said, holding out a black marker. "And I think you're better than your worst moment." Blake took the marker with hands that trembled slightly. "What should I write?" "Whatever's true," Zuri said simply. Blake thought for a moment, then carefully wrote at the bottom of the poster, "Thank you for teaching me that heroes come in all sizes, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is believe in someone. Officer Blake Martinez." He handed the marker back, and Zuri read his words aloud, her lips moving silently as she worked through the longer words. "That's beautiful," she said when she finished. "Daddy, can Officer Martinez come to dinner sometime? I want to meet his son." Jonathan looked at Blake, something like understanding passing between them. "I think that would be nice, baby girl. If Officer Martinez would like to." "I'd like that very much," Blake said, and meant it completely. As they walked out of the community center together, Blake thought about the morning, how it had started with cold coffee and divorce papers, with the weight of failures and the certainty that some things were too broken to fix. Now the evening sun was painting everything golden, and he was walking beside a man who'd shown him what courage looked like, carrying the phone number of a friend who believed in second chances. His phone buzzed with a text from Danny. "Looking forward to dinner, Dad. Maybe we can figure out how to be family again." Blake looked at the message, then at Zuri skipping between him and her father, then at Jonathan's profile against the evening light. "Yeah," Blake said quietly, not sure if he was answering Danny's text or the question life had been asking him for months. "I think we can." For the first time in longer than he could remember, Blake Martinez believed in happy endings.
This completes the emotional story about Officer Blake Martinez learning to choose vulnerability over cynicism, thanks to the grace and wisdom of Sergeant First Class Jonathan Rivers and his daughter Zuri. The story explores themes of unexpected love, forgiveness, and the courage required to rebuild broken relationships. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end.